There's something peculiar about the way legends are born in the American West. Some spring from truth, others from whispers around campfires. But the most intriguing are those that emerge from the ashes of other legends. This is the tale of Michael "Iron Mike" Sullivan, a man whose hammer rang through the streets of Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, in the bitter winter of 1875. A man whose past would turn a quiet mining town into the stage for one of the most remarkable showdowns the territory had ever witnessed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Some say the most dangerous men are those who found peace, for they know the true cost of violence. Iron Mike had spent 5 years building a life in Redemption Creek, his forge becoming the heartbeat of the growing settlement. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against anvil marked the passing of days, a sound as reliable as the sunrise. Few questioned why a man with hands steady enough to craft the finest gun mechanisms in the territory never wore a firearm himself. Even fewer wondered about the scars that marked his forearms, visible when he rolled up his sleeves to work, or the way his eyes constantly scanned the street through his shop's open door. Sheriff Thomas Webb, who'd served with the Union Army during the war, recognized something in the blacksmith's bearing that he never discussed with the townspeople. "There's men who learn to stand straight from drilling with a rifle," he wrote in his journal that winter. "And there's men who learn it from carrying the weight of things they can't put down. Sullivan's the second kind." The story truly begins on a frost-bitten morning in December, when 3 riders from the notorious Carson gang decided that Redemption Creek would make a fine addition to their territory. The town had prospered from its silver mines, and Marcus Carson, the gang's ruthless leader, had developed an appetite for such profitable ventures. The first rider, a wiry man with a face carved by desert winds, walked into Sullivan's forge just as the blacksmith was examining a newly mended plow blade. The stranger's spurs sang against the wooden floor, an odd detail that Iron Mike noted without looking up from his work. "Heard you're the man to see about gun work," the rider drawled, placing a Colt Peacemaker on the workbench. The weapon was well maintained, its brass fittings gleaming in the forge light. "Triggers a mite heavy." Sullivan's calloused hands remained steady on the plow blade. "2 days," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who knows his worth. $3. The stranger's laugh held no warmth. "Thing is, friend, Carson gang gets preferential rates in towns we protect, and we're fixing to protect Redemption Creek real soon." In the silence that followed, the only sound was the crack of burning wood in the forge. Sullivan finally looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Sarah Mitchell, the owner of the general store across the street, would later recall how the temperature seemed to drop when those eyes met the stranger's. $3, Sullivan repeated softly. 2 days. Same as everyone else. The stranger's hand drifted toward his second holster. "Maybe you ain't heard of Marcus Carson, man who trained Wild Bill himself before the war. 7 notches on his gun before he turned 25. A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's lips. "I've heard of him." He turned back to his work, adding almost as an afterthought, "He didn't train Wild Bill." The stranger's face darkened. "You calling my boss a liar?" "No." Sullivan tested the plow blade's edge with his thumb. "Just stating a fact. I knew Bill. Carson didn't train him." The implications of those quietly spoken words hung in the air like forge smoke. The stranger's hand had stopped halfway to his holster, a bead of sweat tracking down his temple despite the December chill. Something in Sullivan's tone, the casual certainty of his statement, sent warning signals through the rider's trail-hardened instincts. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of a coming storm. Change was riding toward Redemption Creek, dark as thunderclouds on the horizon. The quiet life Iron Mike Sullivan had built for himself was about to be tested, and the sound of his hammer striking iron would soon be replaced by different kinds of metal ringing in the winter air. The stranger backed toward the door, his boot heels no longer jingling with such confidence. Carson will hear about this, he promised, though his voice had lost its edge. Sullivan nodded without looking up. Yes, he agreed softly. I expect he will. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Word of the confrontation at Sullivan's Forge spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, carried on whispers and worried glances. By sundown, Sheriff Webb had heard 3 different versions of the exchange, each painting the blacksmith's quiet defiance in increasingly dramatic shades. The truth, as Webb knew, often lay in the details others overlooked. It wasn't what he said, Sarah Mitchell explained to the gathered crowd at her store that evening. It was how the Carson man looked when he left. Like he'd seen something that scared him proper. She paused, arranging cans of beans with careful precision. Reminded me of how my late husband's hunting dog looked the time it cornered what it thought was a sleeping bear. The sheriff found Sullivan still at his forge well after darkness had fallen, the orange glow of the fire painting shadows on the walls. The blacksmith was working on a complex mechanism, his fingers moving with the kind of precision that made Webb's earlier suspicions crystallize into certainty. That's mighty fine work for a plow repair, Webb observed, noting the intricate spring assembly taking shape under Sullivan's hands. Sheriff, Sullivan acknowledged without looking up. Figured you'd stop by. Webb settled onto a worn wooden stool, his badge catching the forge light. Carson gang's got a reputation, Mike. 12 dead in Copper Springs last summer. Whole town burned when they wouldn't pay protection. 13, Sullivan corrected quietly. Young boy died later from his burns. Carson doesn't count children in his tallies. The specific knowledge gave Webb pause. You seem well informed for a man who spent the last 5 years at a forge. The rhythmic sound of hammer on metal filled the silence before Sullivan responded. Man likes to know who's moving through the territory. Like you moved through it? Webb asked carefully. Before you came here? Sullivan's hand stilled on his work. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something that made Webb instinctively straighten his spine. You've been wanting to ask for 5 years, Thomas. Why now? Because I've got 3 more Carson riders coming into town, according to the Telegraph. And I've got a feeling they ain't coming for the view. Webb leaned forward. I need to know what I'm dealing with, Mike, both with them and with you. A log shifted in the forge, sending sparks dancing toward the ceiling. Sullivan returned to his work, but his voice took on a different quality, like steel being tempered. You ever hear of the ghost of Cimarron Pass? Webb's breath caught. Every lawman knew that name. 10 years ago, 27 men ambushed a silver shipment at the pass. No survivors except the guard captain. Story goes he hunted down every last one of the bandits over the next 2 years. Then he vanished. 28 men, Sullivan corrected, testing the mechanism's action. History gets some details wrong. The implications hung in the smoky air. Webb studied the blacksmith with new eyes, seeing past the soot and leather apron to something else. The way he moved, the economical grace that spoke of more than just forge work, the scars that might have come from more than just sparks and hot metal. Carson will test you, Webb said finally. Man like that, he'll want to prove the story's wrong. Man like that, Sullivan replied, never learns the right stories to fear. As if summoned by their conversation, a horse's whinny cut through the night. Both men turned toward the door as the sound of multiple riders approached. The Carson gang wasn't waiting for dawn. Time for you to decide, Sheriff, Sullivan said quietly, reaching beneath his workbench. Whether you want to be here for what happens next. Webb's hand moved to his gun but stopped as he saw what Sullivan had retrieved. A wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. The blacksmith's hands moved over it with familiar reverence. Those aren't forge tools, Webb observed. No, Sullivan agreed softly. They're memories. Been a while since they've seen the light? The wooden box creaked open like a long-sealed tomb. Sheriff Webb caught the gleam of well-oiled metal in the forge light, but Sullivan closed it before he could see more. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by the jingle of spurs and low voices. "Last chance to walk away, Thomas," Sullivan said, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had unnerved the Carson rider earlier. "What's coming isn't the law's business." Webb stood his ground. "Everything in Redemption Creek is the law's business." A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's lips. "Then you might want to know something about Marcus Carson that's not in those wanted posters." He moved toward the forge, shadows dancing across his face. "Man's got to tell left-hand twitches before he draws every time." Before Webb could process the intimate knowledge behind that detail, the front door burst open. 4 men filled the doorway, their shapes black against the starlit night. The leader stepped forward, spurs ringing against the wooden floor. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome before something hard and cruel settled into its lines. "Well now," Marcus Carson drawled, "looks like we found ourselves a stubborn blacksmith." His eyes flicked to Webb. "Evening, Sheriff. This here's just a friendly business discussion. No need for the law to concern itself." Webb's hand stayed near his gun. "Any business in my town concerns me, Carson." Carson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your town? Funny, I was just discussing with my boys how Redemption Creek could use some proper management. Place this prosperous shame, if anything happened to it." Through it all, Sullivan hadn't moved from his position by the forge. His stance was casual, almost relaxed, but Webb noticed how he'd positioned himself with clear lines of sight to both door and window. The sheriff had seen gunfighters take similar positions countless times, a habit born from surviving ambushes. "Your man said you trained Wild Bill," Sullivan spoke suddenly, his voice carrying easily through the tension-filled room. "That was a lie." Carson's face darkened. "You calling me a liar, Smith?" "No." Sullivan shook his head slowly. "Just wondering why a man with your reputation needs to borrow someone else's legend." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Carson's left hand twitched, exactly as Sullivan had predicted. But he didn't draw. Instead, he forced another smile. "Got quite a mouth on you for a simple blacksmith. Makes a man wonder what else you might be." "I'm just a man who wants to be left alone," Sullivan replied softly. "Walk away, Carson. Take your men, ride out, find easier prey. Because if you push this—" He finally looked up, and something in his eyes made 2 of Carson's men step back. "Well, I'd rather not break my promise to be done with killing." The threat was delivered so matter-of-factly that it took a moment to register. When it did, Carson's youngest rider reached for his gun. The metallic whisper of steel clearing leather was deafening in the confined space. "Don't," Sullivan said, still not moving. The single word carried such command that the young man's hand froze halfway to his holster. Carson studied Sullivan with newfound intensity, like a man trying to recall a half-remembered face. "You know, there's something familiar about you, Smith. Something in the way you stand. Reminds me of a ghost story I heard once up Cimarron Way." "Lots of ghosts in the territory," Sullivan replied. "Best be careful which ones you go looking for." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of a storm. Inside the forge, the air grew thick with the weight of violence held in check by the thinnest of margins. 2 legends stood facing each other, one built on cruelty and borrowed glory, the other hammered into shape by grief and justice. The next few moments would determine whether Redemption Creek would witness the death of one legend or the rebirth of another. Sarah Mitchell watched the confrontation unfold from her store window, along with half a dozen other townspeople who'd been drawn by the late-night commotion. The glow from Sullivan's forge spilled onto the street, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with lives of their own. The storm wind rattled her shop's sign, a haunting accompaniment to the drama playing out across the way. "Someone ought to fetch more help," young Tommy Wheeler whispered, but old Eleanor Burke shushed him with a sharp gesture. More guns ain't always the answer, boy, the widow said softly. Sometimes they're what start the trouble in the first place. Inside the forge, Carson took a step forward, his boots scraping against the sawdust-covered floor. You know, Smith, I've been trying to place that voice of yours. Sounds an awful lot like a lawman I met once up near Cimarron. Man had a particular way of talking, quiet-like, just before things got interesting. Sullivan's hands remained steady at his sides, neither reaching for the wooden box nor showing any sign of tension. Lot of men passed through Cimarron. Most didn't leave. That's right. Carson's smile grew colder. Including my brother James. Never did find out who put that bullet in him. Clean shot, they said. Right through the heart, like the shooter knew exactly where to aim in the dark. Sheriff Webb watched the exchange with growing unease. The pieces were falling into place. Carson's presence in Redemption Creek wasn't just about extortion. This was personal, a vendetta masked as business. Your brother, Sullivan said softly, was leading those 28 men at the pass, the ones who didn't just rob that silver shipment, the ones who killed the guards' families camped nearby, women, children. The forge fire popped and crackled, sending sparks floating upward like angry fireflies. Carson's face twisted with a mixture of recognition and rage. By God, he breathed. It is you, the ghost himself. All this time, hiding behind an anvil, playing at honest work. His hand drifted toward his gun. You know how many nights I spent dreaming about this, about finding the man who killed my brother? Your brother, Sullivan's voice remained steady. Made his choice that night. Same choice you're making now. Same choice those men out there are making. He nodded toward Carson's companions. Walk away. Last chance. The youngest of Carson's men, barely more than a boy, shifted nervously. Boss, if he's really the ghost, he's one man, Carson snapped. A legend past his time. Playing blacksmith because he hasn't got the steel for real work anymore. His eyes narrowed. Way I heard it, you quit after Cimarron. Got soft. Found religion, maybe. Not religion, Sullivan replied, just perspective. Learned there's more ways to shape metal than shooting it. Outside, thunder rolled closer, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Sarah Mitchell, still watching from her window, would later swear she saw something change in Sullivan's stance. Not a movement exactly, but a subtle shift, like a mountain settling before an avalanche. You know what your problem is, Ghost? Carson's voice dripped contempt. You think you can walk away from what you are, think you can bury it under honest work and quiet living. But men like us, we don't get to change. We just wear different masks until someone strips them away. Sullivan's gray eyes reflected the forge fire as he finally looked directly at Carson. You're right about one thing, Marcus. I did try to walk away. Spent 5 years trying to build something instead of destroy it. His voice dropped even lower. But you just had to come here, had to push, had to make me remember. The wooden box sat on the workbench, silent as a coffin. Outside, the storm broke in earnest, rain hammering against the forge's roof like scattered gunfire. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it the death of peace that had taken 5 years to build. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the forge in stark white flashes that made the shadows dance like restless spirits. Sheriff Webb had seen enough shootings to recognize the calm before the storm, that razor's edge moment when violence hung suspended like a dropped coin, yet to hit the floor. Danny, Sullivan called suddenly, his eyes never leaving Carson's face. That's your name, isn't it? Danny Reeves from Socorro? The youngest of Carson's men started, his hand instinctively moving away from his gun. How did you... Your mother runs the general store there. Martha. Good woman. Helped me with supplies once, few years back. Sullivan's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. She deserved to lose a son over someone else's vendetta? Carson's face twisted with rage. Shut your mouth, Smith. Danny, don't listen to his tricks. But Sullivan continued, his words cutting through the tension like a well-honed blade. Rest of you too. Jack Turner, with 3 young ones back in Tulsa. Miguel Vega, supporting your sister's family since the fever took her husband. His gray eyes swept over them. I make it my business to know who rides into my town, to know what they're risking, what they're willing to throw away. Webb watched in amazement as uncertainty crept into the outlaws' faces. This wasn't the desperate pleading of a man trying to save his life. This was something else, something that spoke to the remnants of conscience in men who'd tried to bury it. Enough! Carson's roar competed with the thunder. You want to see tricks? Let me show you what happened to the last man who crossed me. His left hand twitched, and this time there was no hesitation as he went for his gun. What happened next seemed to unfold between lightning strikes. Carson's draw was fast, blindingly so, but Sullivan's hand moved with the liquid grace of a lifetime's practice, not toward the wooden box as everyone expected, but to the workbench beside him. The hammer he'd been using earlier sailed through the air with deadly precision, striking Carson's gun hand with a sickening crack. The outlaw's shot went wide, sparks flying as it struck the anvil. His revolver clattered to the floor along with his proud reputation, his gun hand already swelling from broken bones. That's the difference between us, Marcus, Sullivan said softly. You learned to kill. I learned to survive. Danny Reeves and the others stood frozen, their hands hovering near their weapons but not quite daring to draw. They'd heard stories of the ghost's speed, but seeing it in person had stripped away their borrowed courage. Carson, cradling his shattered hand, snarled through pain-clenched teeth. Shoot him, you idiots! Shoot him now! But Sullivan was already moving, his body flowing like water between patches of shadow. Another hammer found Jack Turner's shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a cry of pain. Miguel Vega managed to clear leather before a flying chisel pinned his sleeve to the wooden post behind him with surgical accuracy. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Webb breathed, understanding now why the ghost of Cimarron Pass had become legend. This wasn't just skill with a gun. This was artistry with whatever came to hand. The deadly grace of a man who'd turned violence into a craft as precise as his blacksmithing. Danny Reeves, showing more wisdom than loyalty, dropped his gun belt and raised his hands. I'm out, he announced, his young voice shaking. Mother was right, should have stayed home. Outside in the rain, Sarah Mitchell found herself holding her breath along with the rest of the watching town. They'd expected gunfire, expected blood and death. Instead, they were witnessing something rarer, a legend being reborn not through killing, but through the measured application of force and mercy. But Carson wasn't finished. His left hand was reaching for his boot where a derringer lay hidden. Die, you sanctimonious ghost. The derringer's report was deafening in the confined space of the forge, but the bullet found only empty air where Sullivan had stood a heartbeat before. The blacksmith moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd never truly forgotten his deadly trade, his body spinning away from the shot's path even as his hand found another tool from his workbench. A small file whistled through the air, striking Carson's left wrist with precision. The derringer dropped from nerveless fingers as Carson howled in pain and fury. Outside, the storm's fury matched the violence within, rain hammering against the roof like nature's own percussion to this deadly dance. You don't learn, Marcus, Sullivan said softly, his voice barely carrying over the thunder. Same mistake your brother made, always keeping a hidden weapon, never trusting your main gun would be enough. He shook his head slowly. Pride like that gets men killed. Sheriff Webb, who had drawn his own weapon when the derringer appeared, found himself lowering it slowly. The situation was well in hand, though not in any way he'd expected. He'd seen gunfights, had been in more than his share, but this was something different. This was mastery. Kill him, Carson screamed at his remaining men, but the fight had gone out of them. They'd come expecting to intimidate a simple blacksmith, maybe rough him up a bit. Instead, they'd found themselves facing a legend who could drop a man with a thrown hammer as easily as most men could with a bullet. Danny Reeves took another step back, hands still raised. Mr. Sullivan, sir, I'd like to just walk away now. Go home to Socorro. Like you said, make things right. Sullivan nodded without taking his eyes off Carson. Good choice, boy. Take Miguel with you. He's got family needing him too. His voice hardened slightly. But spread the word. Tell people what you saw here. Tell them Redemption Creek is off limits to men like Carson. Through the forge's window, Sarah Mitchell saw more townspeople gathering despite the rain. Word had spread about the confrontation, and now it seemed half the town was witnessing this moment when their quiet blacksmith revealed his true nature. But what struck her most wasn't his skill or speed. It was his restraint. "You had this planned," Carson spat, his face twisted with pain and hatred. "All of it. Knowing their names, their families, playing on their conscience. You're still the same calculating bastard who hunted my brother down." "No." Sullivan's reply carried genuine sadness. "Your brother died quick and clean. One shot. But you—" He gestured at Carson's shattered hand. "I needed to humiliate. Because you'll live, Marcus. You'll live with a crippled gun hand and a broken reputation. You'll live knowing you found your ghost and he beat you with blacksmith's tools instead of bullets." Thunder cracked overhead as Carson lunged forward with a roar, drawing a hidden knife from his belt with his good hand. But Sullivan had been waiting for this too. His boot came down on the edge of a fallen hammer, flipping it up into his grasp. The tool spun through the air one last time, striking Carson's forehead with mathematical precision. The infamous outlaw dropped like a felled tree, unconscious before he hit the floor. In the sudden silence, broken only by the storm's fury, Sullivan finally turned to Sheriff Webb. "He'll live," the blacksmith said quietly, "though he might wish otherwise for a while. I trust you can handle things from here?" Webb nodded slowly, holstering his unfired gun. "Always wondered why a blacksmith needed to keep his shop laid out so precise-like. Everything in arm's reach. Everything balanced just so." He smiled slightly. "Wasn't about smithing at all, was it?" "A man's habits," Sullivan began. "Tell his true story," Webb finished. "I know. Question is, what story does Redemption Creek tell about tonight?" As the storm's fury began to ease, Redemption Creek stirred to life with an energy that belied the late hour. Dr. Marcus Fuller's office quickly filled with the aftermath of Sullivan's defense, though, as the good doctor noted while tending to Carson's broken hand, he'd never seen violence delivered with such surgical precision. "Clean breaks," Fuller muttered, wrapping Carson's hand. "Set to heal, but he'll never draw fast again. Same with the others. Disabled, but not destroyed." He glanced at Sheriff Webb, who was overseeing the impromptu clinic, almost like it was planned that way. Outside the doctor's office, townsfolk gathered in small groups despite the lingering rain, their voices a mix of awe and speculation. Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of one such gathering, recounting what she'd witnessed through her store window. "It wasn't just the fighting," she explained, her eyes distant with memory. "It was how he knew them all. Their families, their stories. Used their own lives to make them think, to give them a choice." Tommy Wheeler, the young stable hand who'd watched it all, shook his head in wonder. "Ma'am, my pa used to say legends ain't what they seem up close. Usually smaller. But Mr. Sullivan, he's something else entirely." Back at the forge, Sullivan methodically retrieved his scattered tools, checking each for damage before returning it to its precise position. Eleanor Burke watched from the doorway, her aged eyes taking in every detail of his movements. 5 years, she said finally, breaking the contemplative silence. 5 years I've been bringing you my cookpots to mend, watching you build this life. Never once saw you as anything but our blacksmith." She paused, considering. "Never once saw you wrong, neither." Sullivan looked up from his work, a question in his eyes. "The man who fixed my pots, who helped Widow Jenkins with her wagon wheel, who taught young Tommy about honest work. That's just as real as the ghost who faced down Carson tonight." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Maybe more real, come to think of it." A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's lips. "Wisdom like that, Mrs. Burke, is why I chose this town." "Chose us?" She raised an eyebrow. "You mean it wasn't chance brought you here?" I spent 2 years after Cimarron, traveling town to town, looking for somewhere that needed more than just another gun. He ran a hand along his anvil's familiar surface. Redemption Creek had good people, strong people, just needed someone to help them stand their ground. Their conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Webb's return. The lawman's face was troubled as he removed his hat, running fingers through graying hair. "Carson's asking for you," Webb said quietly. "Says he's got something you need to hear. Something about Cimarron that you don't know." Sullivan's hands stilled on his tools. "There's nothing about Cimarron I don't know, Thomas. I was there." He's insistent. Claims it's about why your family was really there that night. Says it wasn't chance that put them in the path of those bandits. The air in the forge seemed to grow heavier, like the pressure before a storm. Eleanor Burke, sensing the shift, quietly withdrew, leaving the two men alone with the weight of the past between them. "Some truths," Sullivan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "are best left buried with the dead. And some," Webb countered, "have a way of clawing their way back up. Question is, Mike, are you ready to face whatever Carson's got to say?" Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a night sky scattered with stars. But in Sullivan's forge, another kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to tear open old wounds and force a man to confront the very things he'd spent 5 years trying to forge into something new. The walk to Dr. Fuller's office felt longer than usual, each step carrying the weight of buried memories. Sullivan moved through the mud-slicked streets with the same quiet grace he'd displayed during the fight, though his mind was elsewhere, back in time, at Cimarron Pass, reviewing every detail of that blood-soaked night. Sarah Mitchell fell into step beside him, a shawl pulled tight against the night's chill. "You don't have to face him alone," she said softly. "Whatever Carson has to say—" "Some burdens," Sullivan replied, his voice gentle but firm, "aren't meant for others to carry." He paused at the doctor's door, adding, "But thank you, Sarah, for understanding why the Smith had to become the ghost again." Inside, Carson lay propped up on a cot, his broken hand swathed in bandages. The infamous gunman looked diminished somehow, stripped of his swagger and lethal reputation. But his eyes still burned with a dark triumph when Sullivan entered. "Figured that'd bring you," he wheezed through pain-clenched teeth. "Man like you, you've probably spent years wondering why they were there that night. Why your family camped at that exact spot, at that exact time." Sullivan remained by the door, his face unreadable. "They were traveling to Santa Fe. Nothing more." "That what you told yourself?" Carson's laugh turned into a cough. "Your wife, your boy, they died thinking it was just bad luck, just wrong place, wrong time. But someone made sure they'd be there." Dr. Fuller moved to intervene, but Sheriff Webb held him back with a slight shake of his head. Some poisons, the lawman knew, had to be drawn out completely. "Someone sent a letter," Carson continued, savoring each word like bitter medicine. "Told your wife about her sick mother in Santa Fe. Made sure she'd take that route on that day. Made sure your family would be there when the silver shipment came through." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sullivan's voice, when it came, carried the chill of mountain winter. "You're lying." "Am I?" Carson's smile was ugly. "Check your wife's papers. Find that letter. See who really orchestrated everything. My brother James, he was just hired muscle, the real architect of Cimarron Pass. Well, that's the ghost story you never solved." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a reminder of the storm just past and perhaps a warning of another approaching. Sullivan stood motionless, his hands that had dealt out such precise violence earlier, now clenched at his sides. "Who?" The single word carried the weight of 5 years of guilt, of questions unasked and answers unfound. "Information like that," Carson replied, "comes with a price. You let me ride out of here, get somewhere safe, and I'll tell you everything." Who wrote the letter? Who planned it all? Why your family had to die so that Silver could disappear? Sheriff Webb watched Sullivan carefully, seeing the war between the peace he'd built and the vengeance that had driven him for so long. The ghost and the blacksmith, two sides of the same man wrestling for control. Think about it, Carson pressed. You've spent all these years hunting the wrong men, living this lie of peace while the real killer's been out there free. Everything you built here, it's all been based on a mistake. Sullivan finally moved, crossing to Carson's cot with that liquid grace that spoke of barely restrained violence. He leaned down, his voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. You're right about one thing, Marcus. Everything I built here was based on something. His eyes held Carson's, and the outlaw's triumphant smile began to fade. It was based on a choice, the same choice I'm making now. The silence stretched like drawn steel, waiting to see which way it would break. Sullivan straightened slowly, his movement deliberate as a smith placing hammer to anvil. The room held its breath, waiting for violence that didn't come. Instead, he turned to Dr. Fuller, with unsettling calm. That wooden box from my forge, he said quietly. Would you send someone to fetch it? Carson's triumphant expression wavered. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd anticipated rage, demands for answers, perhaps even torture. The ghost of Cimarron Pass had been legendary for his relentless pursuit of truth. This measured response was something new, something unpredictable. Tommy Wheeler volunteered to run to the forge, his young legs carrying him swiftly through the muddy streets. Sarah Mitchell, who'd been watching from the doorway, saw something in Sullivan's face that made her heart ache. Not the pain of fresh wounds, but the quiet acceptance of old scars, finally understood. 5 years, Sullivan spoke into the tense silence, his voice carrying the rhythm of hammer on steel. 5 years I've walked past your wanted posters, knowing you were out there, knowing you had connections to Cimarron, but I never came hunting. Because you got soft, Carson spat, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Because I learned something, after the 28th man. Sullivan's eyes were distant with memory. Revenge is like bad iron. You can hammer it all day, but it'll never forge anything worth keeping. Tommy returned with the wooden box, his breath coming in quick gasps. Sullivan took it with a nod of thanks, then set it on the table beside Carson's cot. The outlaw's eyes fixed on it like a snake watching a mongoose. You want to know if I'll trade justice for answers? Sullivan opened the box slowly. Inside lay 2 Colt revolvers, their blued steel showing the kind of care that spoke of regular maintenance despite years of disuse. But beneath them, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was something else, a bundle of letters. Found these in James Carson's saddlebags after Cimarron. Never read them all. Didn't want to. Sullivan's hands moved with familiar precision as he unwrapped the package. Didn't want to know if there was more to it. Thought knowing might make me something worse than what I already was. Carson's face had gone pale. Those are your brother's correspondence, including letters from whoever orchestrated Cimarron Pass. Sullivan laid them on the table, their yellowed pages carrying the weight of tragedy and truth. I chose not to look. Chose to believe that putting down the men who did the killing was enough. Chose to become something more than just another weapon. The room was silent save for the distant rumble of thunder and Carson's ragged breathing. Sheriff Webb found his hand had moved away from his gun, understanding finally dawning in his weathered face. You knew, he said softly. All this time, you had the answers. And chose not to seek them, Sullivan confirmed. Because some truths, Thomas, are like bullets. Once you send them out into the world, you can't control where they land or who they hurt. He turned back to Carson, whose triumphant smile had crumbled to ash. You thought you could break me with this, make me choose between peace and vengeance, but I made that choice 5 years ago, when I put these guns away and picked up a hammer instead. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. The letters, Mr. Sullivan, what will you do with them now? Sullivan's hand rested on the yellowed papers, years of unknown truths waiting to be revealed. His answer would determine not just his own fate, but perhaps the very soul of Redemption Creek itself. The lamplight flickered across the yellowed pages as Sullivan gathered the letters with careful hands. Every eye in the room followed his movements, watching as he carried them to the doctor's coal stove in the corner. For a moment, only the soft crackle of burning coal broke the silence. "Wait!" Carson called out, desperation creeping into his voice. "Don't you want to know? After all these years, don't you need to know who really killed them?" Sullivan paused, the letters held above the stove's open door. "Need? Number I stopped needing answers when I realized they wouldn't bring my family back." His voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd fought his demons and won. "Want? That's a different matter." Sarah Mitchell stepped closer, her shawl drawn tight against more than just the night's chill. "The truth has power, Mike. Maybe not just for you, but for others who might still be in danger from whoever planned this." It was the kind of argument that would have consumed the ghost of Cimarron Pass, driving him to seek justice at any cost. But the blacksmith of Redemption Creek had learned to weigh different metals on his scales. "Truth's like fire, Sarah," he replied softly. "Useful when contained, dangerous when it burns out of control." He turned to Carson, whose face had gone ashen. "You thought these letters would set me back on the hunt, make me abandon what I've built here. But you didn't understand what I learned at Cimarron." "And what's that?" Sheriff Webb asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That justice without mercy is just another form of violence." Sullivan's hands remained steady above the stove, and sometimes the hardest justice is choosing to let the past stay buried. Dr. Fuller, who'd been quietly observing while tending his patients, cleared his throat. "Those letters might prove Carson's involvement in more than just today's events could help bring others to justice. Or start a new cycle of vengeance," Sullivan countered. "How many more ghosts would rise from these pages? How many more lives would be destroyed by truths better left unknown?" The room fell silent again, each person wrestling with the implications. Tommy Wheeler, young enough to still see the world in simpler terms, spoke up from near the door. "But, sir, what if there are others out there? Other families in danger from whoever wrote those letters?" Sullivan turned to the boy, a sad smile touching his lips. "There are always others in danger, Tommy. Always more battles to fight, more wrongs to right. The trick is knowing which fights are worth the cost of winning." With deliberate care, he opened the stove door wider. The coal fire cast dancing shadows across his face, reminiscent of his forge where he'd chosen to build rather than destroy. "Carson wanted to use these letters to turn the blacksmith back into a ghost," he said quietly. "But he forgot something important about ghosts." His hand moved over the stove. "Sometimes they need to rest." The letters fell from his fingers, catching fire almost immediately. Carson let out a strangled cry as years of hidden truths turned to ash before his eyes. Sarah Mitchell reached for Sullivan's arm but stopped when she saw his expression. Not regret, but relief. "You're really letting it go?" Webb asked, wonder in his voice. "All of it?" "No." Sullivan shook his head slowly, watching the flames consume the past. "Not letting it go. Choosing something else instead. Choosing to be the man who builds things, who helps a town stand strong, who teaches young Tommy about honest work." He turned to face them all. Choosing to be the blacksmith instead of the ghost. But even as the letters burned, a rider was pushing his horse hard through the night, carrying news that would test Sullivan's choice sooner than anyone expected. The rider arrived as dawn was breaking over Redemption Creek, his horse lathered and breathing hard from the punishing pace. Sheriff Webb was still at the doctor's office, overseeing the wounded Carson gang members, when Deputy Wilson burst in with the news. "Wire from Silver City," the young deputy gasped, holding out a crumpled telegram. "Judge Parker's escort was hit yesterday. 3 marshals dead. They took him." Webb's face darkened as he read the message. Behind him, Carson let out a harsh laugh despite his injuries. Looks like burning those letters just got real complicated, Ghost, the outlaw wheezed, seeing as Judge Parker was heading here to testify about certain banking connections in the territory. Connections that might have been mentioned in those papers you just turned to ash. Sullivan, who had been helping Dr. Fuller organize his instruments, went very still. Judge Isaac Parker was known throughout the territory as the hanging judge, not for any love of the noose, but for his unflinching pursuit of justice. If he'd been taken, it wasn't for ransom. "How many men?" Sullivan asked quietly, not turning around. "Wire says at least 15, Wilson replied. "Led by a man calling himself Colonel Wade Hampshire, they're moving north through Apache Canyon," Sullivan finished, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room take notice. "Hampshire's not a colonel. He's a banker who bought himself a title and a private army. Specializes in making problems disappear for people who can pay." Sarah Mitchell, who had stayed to help tend the wounded, caught the significance first. "The same kind of people who might have orchestrated Cimarron Pass?" "Maybe." Sullivan finally turned, his eyes meeting Carson's triumphant gaze. "But that's not why they took the judge, is it, Marcus?" Carson's smile grew wider despite his pain. "Like I said, complicated. Hampshire's men will be looking for shelter, somewhere to hold Parker until certain arrangements can be made. Somewhere like the old mission in Broken Rock Valley." Sullivan nodded. "Remote. Defensible. 3 days' ride from here." His hands moved unconsciously, checking the alignment of Fuller's medical tools with the same precision he'd shown with his forge implements. Webb stepped forward. "Mike, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Sullivan's voice was quiet but firm. "Not because of Cimarron, not because of old ghosts, but because right now a good man's life is in danger, and I might be the only one who knows enough to save him." "Might need these back then," Webb said softly, producing Sullivan's wooden box of guns. He'd taken them for safekeeping after the confrontation with Carson. The blacksmith stared at the box for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said finally. "The ghost had his time. This needs something different." He turned to Sarah. "Your late husband's rifle still in your storeroom? The Spencer carbine?" She nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The one you modified last spring. Better sight alignment, smoother action." "A craftsman's weapon," Sullivan explained to the others' questioning looks. "Precise, reliable, like the tools in my forge." He straightened, his decision made. "I'll need supplies, and information about Hampshire's usual tactics." Carson's laugh turned into a cough. "You'll need more than that, Ghost. Hampshire's men are professionals. Not like my brother's bunch at Cimarron. They won't break and run just because you whisper at them in the dark." "Good," Sullivan replied, and for the first time there was something of the ghost in his smile. "Because I'm not going to whisper. I'm going to teach them the difference between a legend and a craftsman." Outside, the sun was clearing the mountains, painting Redemption Creek in shades of promise and warning. A new day was dawning, bringing with it a chance for Sullivan to prove that sometimes the best way to deal with the past isn't to bury it or burn it, but to forge it into something new. The next hour saw Sullivan's forge transformed into a war room of sorts, though not in any way the townspeople expected. Instead of checking weapons or plotting attacks, the blacksmith was at his workbench, carefully examining what appeared to be ordinary metal tools. "Throwing hammers are fine for close work," he explained to Sheriff Webb and Sarah Mitchell as his hands moved with practiced precision. "But Hampshire's men will be expecting the ghost's tactics. Time to show them something new." Sarah watched him modify a set of files, their edges carefully honed to catch the light in a particular way. "You're not just planning to rescue the judge, are you?" she asked softly. "You're planning to end Hampshire's whole operation." "Man like that," Sullivan nodded toward his forge, where metal was heating to a cherry red. "He's a tool for bigger men, the kind who might have written those letters about Cimarron. Take him down properly might make them think twice about their next move." Deputy Wilson, who'd been sent to gather supplies, returned with the Spencer carbine from Sarah's store. The weapon was beautiful in its utility, its wood stock gleaming with care, its action speaking of Sullivan's previous modifications. Found these too, Wilson added, producing a set of surveyor's tools. Thought they might be useful. Way you work. Sullivan's small smile carried approval. Good thinking. Rangefinding is more than just guesswork. He turned to Webb. Hampshire's men will have the mission watched. Multiple layers of security. Professional setup. Against which you're bringing files and measuring tools? Webb's tone carried concern rather than doubt. Against which I'm bringing precision, Sullivan corrected, testing the balance of a modified hammer. Ghost of Cimarron Pass won people's fear. But fear fades. Precision? He nodded toward his forge. That's what keeps my customers coming back. Eleanor Burke arrived with a packet of dried herbs, similar to those that had helped during the Carson fight. Different mixture this time, she explained. Less about scaring horses, more about affecting men's judgment. Old Apache remedy. Speaking of judgment, Carson called from his cot, where he was still under guard. Hampshire's men won't be fooled by forest remedies and thrown tools. They're killers. Ghost. Professional killers. No, Sullivan replied without looking up from his work. They're men who kill professionally. There's a difference. His hands never stopped moving as he spoke, checking measurements, adjusting edges. Professional killers want you to know they're dangerous. Men who kill professionally? They just want the job done. Sarah watched him work, understanding dawning in her eyes. Like a blacksmith with his forge. Every strike measured, every motion planned. Hampshire expects the ghost, Sullivan confirmed. He'll be ready for legends and shadows. But legends don't carry measuring tools. They don't calculate angles or plan precise effects. He held up one of his modified files, its edge catching the forge light like a promise. They don't treat violence like a craft. Deputy Wilson, young enough to still believe in direct approaches, frowned. But surely, at some point, it'll come down to shooting. Maybe. Sullivan's voice carried the rhythm of his hammer strikes. But if I do this right, if I measure twice and strike once like any good craftsman? He let the thought hang as he returned to his work. Outside, the town was coming alive with morning activity, though there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Word about Judge Parker had spread, and with it, speculation about what their blacksmith would do. They'd seen him face down Carson's gang with tools and wisdom. But Hampshire's men were different, cold professionals who'd killed 3 marshals without hesitation. As if reading their thoughts, Sullivan paused in his work. Fear's a weapon, he said quietly. But so is hope. So is precision. So is the knowledge that every problem, even violence, has a solution if you approach it with the right tools and proper measurements. He turned to Sarah, his eyes carrying the certainty of a man who'd found his true path. Time to show them what a craftsman can do. The old mission at Broken Rock Valley stood like a weathered sentinel against the afternoon sky, its adobe walls glowing gold in the westering sun. From his position in the scrub oak half a mile away, Sullivan studied the structure through the surveyor's glass, measuring angles and distances with the same precision he'd used to align a new piece on his forge. 4 men on the walls, he muttered to himself, making notes in the dirt. 2 in the bell tower, rotating pairs along the perimeter. His fingers traced patterns in the earth, calculating trajectories and timing with mathematical certainty. Sheriff Webb, who'd insisted on accompanying him at least this far, watched with growing understanding. Where the ghost of Cimarron Pass might have used darkness and fear, the blacksmith was approaching this like any other crafting project, measuring twice, planning every step. Hampshire's inside, Webb reported, lowering his own spyglass. Saw him through the west window. Judge Parker's likely in the old chapel section, Sullivan nodded, adding this detail to his calculations. They'll be expecting approach from the north or east. Better cover, obvious routes. His hand moved to one of his modified files, its edge catching the sunlight. Which is why we're here on the west. We? Webb raised an eyebrow. Thought you wanted me to head back to town. Need you to be ready with the wagon once this starts, Sullivan confirmed. Judge Parker might not be in condition for a long ride. He paused, checking another measurement. And if this goes wrong, someone needs to tell Sarah and the others I tried it my way, not the ghosts. The afternoon wind carried the scent of sage and approaching rain. Sullivan had timed this too, knowing the storm would provide cover of a different sort than his usual darkness. Eleanor's herbs were already in position, planted upwind where the coming rain would release their effects gradually. They're professionals, Webb reminded him, echoing Carson's warning. Won't spook easy like common bandits. Don't need them spooked, Sullivan replied, checking the Spencer carbine one last time. Just need them precise. Professionals follow patterns, maintain discipline, makes them predictable. He gestured to his dirt calculations. Like the timing of a hammer strike or the heat of a forge, get the measurements right, everything else follows. A glint of metal from the bell tower caught his eye. Right on schedule, the guards were rotating positions. Sullivan's hand moved to his modified tools, each one balanced and measured for a specific purpose. No more random throws or improvised weapons. These were instruments crafted for exactitude. Hampshire's men killed those marshals clean, Webb said quietly. No hesitation. No mercy. Yes. Sullivan's voice carried the certainty of a man who'd found his truth. Because that was their job. But a craftsman. He held up one of his tools, studying how it caught the light. A craftsman takes pride in more than just the result. He cares about the method, the precision, the elegance of the work. The wind picked up, carrying the first drops of rain. In the mission, Hampshire's men would be adjusting their patterns, compensating for reduced visibility and wet conditions. But like any professionals, they'd do it by the book, predictably, measurably. Time for you to go, Thomas, Sullivan said, rising smoothly into a crouch. Storm's almost here. Webb hesitated. The ghost could handle this, he said carefully. If you needed him. Sullivan checked the angle of the wind one final time, his movements precise as a compass drawing a circle. The ghost hunted men, he replied softly. The blacksmith's going to show them the difference between killers and craftsmen. As Webb moved carefully back toward where they'd left the wagon, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. Sullivan was already in motion, each step measured, each movement calculated. He wasn't disappearing into shadows like the ghost would have. He was moving with the deliberate grace of a master craftsman approaching his forge. The storm broke overhead, right on schedule, and the next phase of Sullivan's precisely measured plan began to unfold. Hampshire's men never stood a chance, though not for the reasons they might have expected. There was no ghost haunting their steps, no legend emerging from the shadows. Instead, they faced something far more inexorable, the precise, measured execution of a craftsman's plan. The storm arrived exactly as Sullivan had calculated, its wind carrying Eleanor's herbs through the mission grounds. The guards in the bell tower found their vision blurring, their movements becoming sluggish but not panicked. When modified files whistled through the rain with mathematical precision, striking pressure points Sullivan had learned from his smithing work, they fell quietly, professionally, like tools being set down after use. Hampshire himself realized something was wrong when the perimeter guards failed to check in on schedule. But by then, Sullivan was already inside the mission, moving not like a ghost but like a craftsman through his workshop, each step measured, each action precise. It's him, one of Hampshire's men whispered, his professional calm cracking. The ghost of Cimarron. The modified hammer that struck his shoulder cut off the words, the impact calculated to disable without killing. Sullivan emerged from the rain-swept shadows, the Spencer carbine held with a craftsman's grip. Not the ghost, he corrected quietly. Just a blacksmith who measures twice. Hampshire stood in the chapel doorway, his expensive suit incongruous in the old mission. Behind him, Judge Parker sat bound but unbowed, watching with judicial interest as his rescue unfolded. "Fascinating approach," the judge commented, as if observing a particularly novel legal argument, rather different from the stories about Cimarron Pass. Hampshire's hand moved toward his gun with professional speed, but Sullivan had already measured that distance, calculated that arc. The modified file struck Hampshire's wrist with surgical precision, just as the self-styled colonel's fingers brushed his holster. "You don't understand," Hampshire growled through the pain. "The men I work for, they're bigger than legends, bigger than ghosts." "Maybe." Sullivan worked methodically to free the judge, his movements economical as always. "But right now, they're not here. Just you, your men, and a craftsman who's measured every angle in this room." The fight, such as it was, ended with the same precision it had begun. Each of Hampshire's remaining men fell to carefully aimed shots or precisely thrown tools, their professional discipline undone by a different kind of professionalism altogether. When Sheriff Webb arrived with the wagon, he found Hampshire and his men bound with metalworkers' precision, Judge Parker calmly discussing legal precedents and Sullivan checking measurements in his notebook. "Not quite what I expected," Webb admitted, surveying the scene. "Life rarely is," Judge Parker observed, accepting Webb's help into the wagon. "Though I suspect certain banking interest will be quite disturbed to learn their preferred problem solver has been solved." Hampshire glared at Sullivan from among his bound men. "They'll send others," he warned. "Men who won't underestimate you." "Probably," Sullivan agreed, collecting his tools with a craftsman's care. "But they'll be expecting the ghost, and like any good blacksmith knows, the right expectations are half the work." The ride back to Redemption Creek was quiet, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves and wagon wheels. As they approached town, Sullivan spoke one last time to Hampshire. "Tell your employer something for me," he said softly. "Tell them Cimarron Pass was their masterwork. But mastery isn't about one perfect piece, it's about the craft itself, about making something that lasts." Dawn was breaking over Redemption Creek when they arrived. Sarah Mitchell waited with the others, worry turning to relief as she saw Sullivan returning not as a ghost, but as their blacksmith. "The forge will be cold," she said as he approached. Sullivan smiled, the expression of a craftsman returning to his workshop. "Then we'll heat it up again. There's always more work for those who care about doing it right." The ghost, it seemed, had finally found peace. Not in vengeance or legend, but in the precise, measured craft of building something worth keeping. As his hammer rang out across Redemption Creek once more, it sang not of death, but of creation, not of endings, but of work yet to come. For in the end, the most lasting legends aren't about the lives we take, but the things we choose to build instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.